Aita for resenting my parents for having me as a bringing the family together baby and putting so much on me before I was even born. From the moment I was conceived, my life was already a preordained burden. I wasn't welcomed into this world with the natural anticipation that accompanies the birth of a child. Number I was engineered, created for the singular purpose of mending a fractured family, an experiment that had already been set in motion long before I even took my first breath. My parents, both widowed and grieving, were under the impression that a child would heal their broken homes. The sad irony is that my arrival was not a miracle of love, but a desperate measure to fix something that was beyond repair. My mother, a widow for 2 years, and my father, possibly 3 or 4, each brought with them children from their previous marriages. My mother's kids, one 6 and one 7, were already set in their ways, scarred by the death of their father. My father's son, aged 9, was similarly unwelcoming to the prospect of a new family. Their attempt at blending these two broken worlds was met with resistance from the start, and anyone with eyes could see that this was no love story, but rather a fractured attempt at unity that was bound to fail. Despite the tension, my parents were determined to make it work. The solution, they decided, would be me. I wasn't a child in their eyes, but a symbol, a final act of desperation. They believed that my birth would serve as the balm to heal the wounds that had been inflicted long before I was even born. That somehow I, a child not even given the chance to form my own identity, would unite two broken families and bring the love and connection that their previous marriages failed to provide. But this notion was fundamentally flawed. No amount of optimism could erase the deep-seated resentment that already existed. My half-siblings never wanted a sibling who wasn't the product of their biological parents. I wasn't welcomed. I was merely tolerated as a catalyst for their parents' misguided attempt to fix their relationships. The reality was harsher than any of us could have imagined. From the moment I was born, I was never truly loved. I wasn't embraced as a family member. Instead, I was a pawn, moved into place to fix something that was too broken to be fixed. My parents didn't seem to understand that no matter how hard they tried, the rift between their families couldn't be bridged by the arrival of a child. The idea that a baby could somehow heal years of hurt was not just naive. It was a delusion. No one, especially not me, had a say in any of this. I wasn't given the gift of being a child. I was given the burden of an impossible role, to be the one who could and would heal everything. And it wasn't just the half-siblings who rejected me. My parents began to resent me as well. They saw me not as their son, but as a failed experiment. I was supposed to bond with my half-siblings, to make them feel loved and accepted in a family that had been stitched together out of the remnants of their old lives. But when they rejected me, I was told that it was still my responsibility to try harder. I had no choice but to keep pushing for something that was never going to happen. I was forced to carry the weight of their unrealistic expectations, and each time I failed, it was as if I was the problem. This wasn't just about family dynamics, it was about the expectations placed on me from the start. I wasn't allowed to be just a kid. No, I was burdened with the idea that I had to fix things that were never my fault, and my parents never let me forget it. The idea that my existence was meant to solve the problems they couldn't fix was hammered into my head from a young age. They constantly reminded me that it was my job to reach out to my half-siblings, to keep trying, no matter how many times they pushed me away. Every rejection, every failed attempt at bonding, every ignored gesture was met with the same response. You have to try harder. The reality hit me as I got older. My role wasn't to be loved. It wasn't to be a cherished family member. It was to be the one who bridged the gap, who somehow healed the wounds they couldn't. And when that didn't happen, when it became clear that I could never fulfill their impossible dream, I was made to feel as if it was my fault. My parents may have thought I was the glue that would fix everything, but all I ever felt like was the weight of their failures. As I grew older, the weight of what my parents had done to me became clearer. They didn't just create me to bond the family. They expected me to serve as the embodiment of their regrets. With each passing year, the more I understood the tension that existed, the more I felt like a misplaced variable in an equation that never worked. My parents tried to pretend it was normal, that all siblings had some degree of difficulty bonding, but the reality was far more insidious. They constantly pushed me to try harder, to reach out to my half-siblings, to somehow force a bond that was never meant to be. But it was clear from the start that they never wanted a relationship with me. This wasn't just about the indifference of my half-siblings. It was about how my parents treated me too. The more I grew into myself, the more I realized that their resentment was subtle but unmistakable. When I failed to fulfill their expectations, when I wasn't the perfect unifying factor they had envisioned, they would show their disappointment. They never said it outright, but I could see it in their eyes. Every time I failed to build connections with my half-siblings, every time I felt rejected, the blame was subtly placed on my shoulders. My parents held me accountable for the failure of a situation I had never chosen to be part of. The way they spoke to me only reinforced this sense of responsibility. They would tell me that it was my job, my duty, to reach out, to break through the emotional walls that had been built up for years, and yet I was never taught how to succeed in this role. I was thrown into a situation where I had to navigate complex family dynamics without any guidance. It was a game where the rules were never clearly defined, and every time I tried to play, the goalposts were moved further away. Every failed attempt was met with a silent reprimand, a subtle reminder that I was never enough. The more I struggled, the more I realized I wasn't playing to win. I was simply playing to survive. And it wasn't just about rejection from my half-siblings. The strain in my relationship with my parents became more evident as well. The love they claimed to feel for me often felt conditional, tied to my performance, to whether or not I was able to do what they wanted me to do. It was as if they had never truly seen me for who I was, but only as the means to an end. The more I failed to unite the family, the more I felt like a disappointment to them. The invisible weight of expectations they had placed on me slowly suffocated whatever affection they might have once had. The resentment I felt toward them began to grow as I got older. I wasn't just frustrated with my half-siblings for not accepting me. I was angry at my parents for having brought me into this situation in the first place. I began to see how my existence was shaped not by any natural love or bond, but by a calculated decision to fix something that wasn't meant to be fixed. They had raised me with the belief that I had a purpose greater than my own happiness, greater than my own peace. It was as if my very identity was a consequence of their unresolved trauma. The truth was, my parents had put their hopes and dreams into me, not because they wanted me to thrive, but because they wanted me to fill the empty spaces in their own fractured lives. When my half-siblings got married, when they had children of their own, I wasn't invited to be part of those moments. The weddings came and went, and I was excluded, left on the periphery. It felt like my existence was a mere footnote in the life of a family that had never truly accepted me. My parents encouraged me to send gifts, to reach out, to try and break through the emotional barriers, but each time I tried, I was met with cold indifference. My parents, who had created me with the hope that I would unite the family, didn't seem to understand why I felt hurt by this rejection. They continued to push me to try harder, to do what I was supposed to do, unite people who didn't want to be united. The deeper I delved into the reality of my existence, the more I began to resent the circumstances surrounding my birth. It wasn't just about being unwanted or rejected, it was about the unrealistic expectations that had been placed on me from the moment I was conceived. My parents had never truly seen me as an individual with my own needs, desires, or dreams. No, I was merely a tool in their quest to mend the wounds they couldn't heal on their own. They had hoped, believed even, that I would somehow magically fix their broken families, but what they failed to see was that no amount of love from me could change the deep-rooted resentment that festered between us all. My very existence, rather than fostering unity, seemed to perpetuate division. Over time, I began to see the true nature of the dynamics within our home. It wasn't just the cold indifference from my half-siblings that weighed on me. It was the subtle resentment from my parents. They couldn't mask it. Every time I didn't live up to their expectations, every time I failed to create the bonds they wanted so desperately, I felt their disappointment in ways words could not express. My parents weren't angry with me for who I was, but rather for who I wasn't. The perfect child that would heal the emotional scars of a family that was too far gone. And every time I couldn't fix it, they would remind me that it was still my job to try. That burden was never mine to carry, but it had been forced upon me, and with it came a deep sense of failure. By the time I reached my teenage years, the emotional toll was overwhelming. I could no longer pretend that everything was fine. I could no longer hide the hurt I felt in my chest when I realized I had been brought into the world for a purpose that had nothing to do with me as a person. It was in those years that I began to question everything: my parents' motives, the very foundation of our family, and the role they had assigned to me. I began to understand that love, the kind of love they said they felt for me, was conditional. My existence had never been about nurturing me, but about fulfilling a mission that had nothing to do with my happiness. It was around this time that I realized the most painful truth. My parents didn't resent me outright, but they resented the fact that I was failing to do what they had hoped I would. They were angry at me, not for who I was, but for who I couldn't be. I was supposed to be the glue. I was supposed to fix everything. But no matter how hard I tried, no matter how many efforts I made, nothing ever changed. The expectations they placed on me were impossible to meet. The weight of those expectations became unbearable. I wasn't a son to them. I was a project, a means to an end. And when that project failed, I became a reminder of everything they couldn't fix. This frustration reached its peak during major milestones in my half-siblings' lives. Weddings, births, family celebrations, they all came and went without my involvement. My parents would encourage me to reach out, to send gifts, to try and be a part of their special moments. But each time I did, I was met with cold dismissal. The barriers between us became more than just emotional. They were physical too. My half-siblings didn't want me there, and I could see that my parents, who had hoped I would be the one to bridge that gap, were slowly starting to accept the reality that it was never going to happen. They too had begun to resign themselves to the fact that I was never going to fulfill the role they had envisioned for me. The more I reflected on my life, the more I began to resent not just my half-siblings for their rejection, but my parents for ever putting me in the position they had. They had treated me as if my life was merely a means to fix something that was inherently unfixable. They had expected me to be the answer, the one thing that could make everything right. But I wasn't an answer to their problems. I was a person with my own life, my own identity, and my own needs. I wasn't given the freedom to explore that. Instead, I was stuck in a role I never asked for, and as I grew older, the resentment only deepened. As the years went on, I began to develop an understanding of the injustice that had been quietly wrought upon me. I wasn't just a child born into a family. I was a child born with a purpose, and that purpose was never to be fulfilled on my terms. From the start, my parents had created an unrealistic narrative, one in which I was the savior of their broken family, the missing piece of a puzzle that could only fit if I stretched myself beyond recognition. But no matter how many pieces of myself I tried to give away, no matter how much I tried to conform to their vision, the puzzle never took shape. The more I grew, the more I realized that the foundation of this family wasn't built on mutual respect or love, but on wishful thinking and the impossible hope that a child could fix the irreparable. There was a deep disconnect that I couldn't ignore anymore. My half-siblings remained distant, cold even, and despite all the attempts my parents made to force some semblance of connection, the gulf between us only seemed to widen. It was as if I was not only alienated by them, but also by the weight of their unmet expectations. I began to see that true reconciliation would never come through forced interactions, through coerced affection, or through gifts and phone calls that were more obligations than heartfelt gestures. My parents never truly understood this. They believed that effort alone could solve the problem, that if I just kept reaching out, kept trying, everything would eventually fall into place. But what they never considered was that genuine relationships can't be manufactured. They have to be nurtured naturally, and if the foundation is cracked, no amount of effort can repair it. The emotional toll of being rejected so consistently by both my half-siblings and my parents began to weigh heavily on me. Every birthday, every holiday, every milestone was a stark reminder of how alienated I was. It was as if I was always a bystander to the family's happiness, watching from the edges, excluded from the very thing I was supposed to be uniting. And the more I realized that I would never fit into the role I was assigned, the more I began to resent not just the situation, but also the people who had placed me in it. It was a suffocating feeling, like living your whole life in a cage built by someone else's expectations, unable to break free, unable to live as who you truly were. But the resentment I felt toward my half-siblings, the rejection, was nothing compared to the resentment I felt toward my parents. They had not only created this problem, but had deliberately chosen to make me the centerpiece of a family dynamic that was doomed from the start. I wasn't given a voice in any of it. My existence was manipulated to serve an agenda that I never agreed to. And as I grew older and my self-awareness deepened, I began to see how much of my life had been dictated by this false premise. My parents had never truly seen me as an individual. I was a project, a solution to their brokenness, nothing more. It wasn't just about the rejection anymore. It was about the disillusionment I felt when I realized the truth, that my parents had, from the very beginning, conditioned me to accept a role that had never been meant for me. They had placed unreasonable expectations upon my shoulders, believing that I could somehow fix what was inherently unfixable. I wasn't just hurt by their constant disappointment. I was betrayed by the realization that they had never truly seen me. I was a means to an end, a tool to achieve a goal that had nothing to do with my happiness or well-being. I wasn't a son in their eyes. I was an instrument, a well-intended but ultimately flawed attempt to fix their broken past. The culmination of all this emotional strain reached its peak when I hit my breaking point. My parents would continue to encourage me to send gifts, to reach out, to try and reconnect. But it was clear by now that the effort wasn't mutual. I was trying to fix a family that didn't want fixing, and I was doing it alone. I began to speak out about the truth I had long suppressed. I resented them. I resented them for bringing me into this world for a purpose that was never mine, for burdening me with a role I couldn't possibly fulfill. I resented the idea that I had been created to heal their wounds when no one had ever thought to ask me what I needed. My parents didn't understand the gravity of what I was saying. They still tried to justify their actions, to tell me that my feelings were unwarranted, that I had no reason to resent them for something that was so normal to them. But I knew, deep down, that I was entitled to my anger. I had lived a life defined by their choices, and I was finally taking a stand. As time went on, the rift between my parents and me only seemed to widen. The facade of unity that they had so desperately tried to construct, with me as the cornerstone, crumbled completely. What they had failed to realize in their well-meaning but ultimately misguided efforts was that love cannot be built on an unstable foundation. They had tried to create a bond between us all by projecting their unresolved grief onto my shoulders, and in doing so, they had forgotten something crucial. The foundation of any relationship is trust and mutual respect, not the expectations of an idealized family. They had never asked if I wanted to be that fixer, that unifying force. It was simply assumed that I would step into that role without question, without regard for my own feelings or desires. But what they couldn't comprehend, what they failed to see, was that I wasn't a blank canvas to be painted with their expectations. I wasn't a solution to their fractured past, a quick fix for the complicated web of relationships they had tried to build. I was a person in my own right, with my own history, my own emotions, my own struggles. I had my own needs and desires that had nothing to do with their hopes for reconciliation. The reality of the situation was painful. They had imposed a life on me without ever asking if I was okay with it. They had expected me to be their therapist, their savior, without realizing that the only person I was supposed to save was myself. The more I struggled with their expectations, the more I began to withdraw into myself. I couldn't bear the constant pressure to be something I was never meant to be. I couldn't continue trying to repair a broken family, a task that was simply too monumental for a single person to shoulder. The more they pushed, the more I resisted, and the more I saw their reactions, the more I realized that they were disappointed in me for not fulfilling the role they had created for me. They couldn't understand why I had withdrawn. To them, it was a failure on my part, a rebellion against what they had envisioned. To me, it was an act of self-preservation, an effort to reclaim my own identity, separate from the burdens they had placed on me. And yet, despite all this, there was still this lingering expectation. My parents, for all their failings, still believed that I was the key to uniting the family. It was exhausting to be treated as the only person capable of bringing everyone together, and yet being told at every turn that my efforts weren't enough. My half-siblings, though they hadn't openly rejected me for some time, had made it clear in subtle ways that they didn't want to be part of the family I was supposed to build. Their indifference to me hurt in ways that words couldn't express. And my parents, as much as they tried to encourage me to make things right, failed to see that the real issue was not my inability to act as the emotional glue, but the fact that they had created an untenable situation to begin with. It was during this period of deep frustration that I realized I had become trapped in an endless cycle of disappointment and unmet expectations. My parents would continue to push, continue to remind me of my duty to reach out, to break through the walls that my half-siblings had built. But I began to see the futility of it all. I was trapped between the guilt of failing to live up to their ideals and the knowledge that no matter how hard I tried, I could never fix what was fundamentally broken. The emotional toll of carrying this weight for so long began to show in ways I couldn't ignore. I was more than just sad. I was emotionally exhausted, drained by years of trying to fulfill a role I was never meant to play. And still, even after all this time, my parents couldn't understand why I resented them. When I finally found the courage to speak out, to tell them how much their expectations had hurt me, how much I resented being used as a means to an end, they couldn't comprehend it. They still thought I was just upset because of the normal family struggles that everyone goes through. But it wasn't normal. It wasn't just about the fact that families don't always get along. It was about the fundamental injustice of my existence being manipulated for someone else's desires. I was no longer their child in the way that mattered. I was a symbol, a tool to achieve something they thought would bring healing. And in their eyes, it was my failure to fulfill that purpose that hurt them the most. But what they failed to see was that it was their actions, their decisions, that had driven me to this point. I wasn't just reacting to the circumstances I was born into. I was responding to the ways they had shaped my life from the very beginning. As I reached the pinnacle of my emotional turmoil, something inside me finally snapped. I could no longer carry the weight of all their expectations, all their dreams for a family that would never be. I could no longer pretend that I was okay with the way things were. The years of being burdened by their misguided hopes, of constantly trying to live up to an ideal that was never meant for me, had taken their toll. It wasn't just resentment anymore. It was freedom. I realized that the only way for me to move forward was to let go of the role I had been forced into, to shed the false identity they had tried to craft for me. I didn't owe them an explanation for my choices or my emotions. I owed myself the freedom to live on my terms, to be authentically myself, without the weight of their unrelenting demands. I think the most painful realization I came to was that my parents would never truly understand. They had lived with the belief that everything would eventually work out if they just kept pushing, if they just kept trying. They didn't understand that love, true, unconditional love, cannot be built on the foundation of expectations. Love doesn't come from strategies or manipulation. It comes from respect, from the willingness to accept people for who they are, flaws and all. But they had failed to understand that, and the more I tried to express this to them, the more they insisted that I was just being difficult, just overreacting. They saw my need for space, my need to separate from the family dynamic they had forced upon me, as a betrayal. But in truth, I was not betraying them. I was simply betraying the version of me they had created, the one that existed solely for their benefit. There was a part of me that still longed for some kind of reconciliation, some shred of connection. But I realized that the more I held on to that dream, the more I was dragging myself through an endless cycle of emotional self-doubt and hurt. The truth was, family was never about forced bonds or trying to fit into a pre-designed mold. It was about mutual understanding, about giving each other the space to be who we truly are and accepting each other without conditions. My parents had failed to give me that space, and in doing so, they had failed to understand the most basic principle of human connection, that love doesn't come from obligation, it comes from respect and choice. At this point, I realized that I needed to distance myself, emotionally and physically, from the weight of all their expectations. I needed to let go of the idea that I could fix everything, that I could somehow become the glue that held a family together. I had to accept that reconciliation was not something I could force, nor was it something that could be achieved just by willing it into existence. It was a two-way street, one that required effort from all parties involved. But more than that, I had to acknowledge that my happiness didn't depend on a family that couldn't accept me for who I was. I couldn't continue to sacrifice myself for the sake of their illusion of unity. As I moved forward in life, I carried with me a deep sense of loss, not just for the family I had hoped for, but for the years I had spent trying to fit into a role that was never meant for me. I grieved for the person I could have been, the person I might have become, if only I had been allowed to forge my own path from the beginning. But even with that loss, there was also a sense of empowerment. I had finally stepped into my own truth. I no longer needed to prove myself to anyone. The freedom I felt was unparalleled. I realized that the only approval I needed was my own, and the only expectations I needed to meet were my own. Ultimately, my parents would never fully understand the gravity of the impact their decisions had on me. They would continue to see me through the lens of their own desires and unmet needs. But I had come to terms with that reality. I had come to understand that my worth was not defined by their broken dreams. I was not a solution to their problems. I was a person with my own life, my own dreams, and my own story. And that was something no one could take away from me. The last step in my journey was realizing that I could walk away from their expectations, from their unreasonable demands, and still be whole. I didn't need them to heal or complete me. I had the power to heal myself. And that, in the end, was the greatest freedom I could ever achieve. In the end, what I've learned is simple. We are not defined by others' expectations. We are not here to fulfill someone else's dreams or play a role we never chose. True freedom comes from accepting who we are and letting go of the weight of unrealistic standards. The road to healing isn't easy, but it begins when we choose to live for ourselves, not for anyone else's approval. My journey is mine, and yours is yours. Embrace your truth, because that's where real strength lies. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And hey, if you're feeling it, drop a comment. Let's keep it real.